For more on the climate conference and today's developments in Copenhagen, we're joined by Lane Green, an international correspondent for The Economist. He recently returned from covering the talks in Copenhagen. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
What will be the legacy of the Copenhagen meeting?
Well, I think the treaty conference is going to send a signal to the entire world that both rich and poor countries are taking carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions seriously. And that will send a massive economic signal to the world's energy industry, to its transport industry, and to everybody who emits carbon dioxide and these other gases, that there will be a concerted action to make them fall. And that's a big economic signal because investments in new factories and power plants are all going to be affected by the result of this conference.
Right. Well, you covered the conference in Copenhagen. What occurred there? Give us your sense of what happened, that it's difficult for us to perhaps comprehend, given that we're watching it from such a distance.
Right. Well, I think at the end of the conference here, everybody's talking about America on one side and China on the other. And as the two biggest emitters in the world, that certainly is an important dynamic. But I think one of the most interesting aspects was the difference between some of the poor countries. China is the leader of the so-called G77, actually 130-something poor countries in the world. But within that bloc, we have tiny countries that have committed absolutely no sin against the environment, yet stand to suffer some of climate change's biggest effects, some of these small island states, for example. And so it's important to remember that the interests of a Maldives or a Tuvalu are not the same as a China, and yet they tried very hard to stay publicly united as one bloc.
And do you think that they made a good stand for themselves?
I think they did. They certainly kept a public face of unity, despite the fact that we have huge emitters alongside countries that emit hardly at all.
And those two huge emitters, the United States and China, do you think that they're going to be able to cut their emissions going forward?
I think there's no doubt that they're going to cut their emissions, but China, remember, is only going to slow down the rate at which its emissions increase. So China is already set to continue emitting more and more, but it is promising to emit more and more on a slower curve. It says it'll emit less per dollar of GDP, but China's GDP is, of course, growing very rapidly, which means its carbon dioxide emissions are set to keep on growing.
But will they be able to cut the emissions enough, do you think, to satisfy the developing world, these countries like the Maldives, like the Bangladeshis, that have not contributed so much to global warming, yet are suffering the consequences enormously?
It's a good question and a fair question, and a late-breaking analysis by the UN said that the promises of emission cuts, if you added them all up for all the countries in the world, might result in global warming of about 3 degrees, when the countries involved all said that they were aiming for a target of 2 degrees. So we might look for those targets to get tighter in the future if they don't look like they're strong enough in the short term.
Right. And very briefly, where do we go from here?
Well, we have to flesh out a lot of the details of the treaty because before the conference started 2 weeks ago, it was obvious that it wasn't going to be possible to get every single detail of this treaty. A lot of things have to be worked out, particularly on financing. How are rich countries going to help poor countries both adapt to climate change and help them green their sort of power sector so they don't add to the problem of climate change? And this is billions and billions of dollars, tens and hundreds of billions, yet to be fleshed out. And that will be a lot of work over the next 12 months.
All right, Lane Green, thank you very much for joining us on the program.
Thank you.